For the opportunity to speak here at the ARL Expo. Ever since they started doing this, I thought this was the right thing to do, and it turned the ball arena from probably the most deserted part of the Hampvention to the busiest part of the convention. So hats off to the ARL. I'm going to give a few hints and tips about kit building, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how to put on a PL259 connector. Now, actually, I was going to do some live soldering, and I didn't see a table, so I left the stuff out in the car. So, but I do have the slides that shows the exact details of what we're going to be doing, and take the mystery out of putting those dreaded PL259s on. First thing about building kits, how many of you have ever built a kit? Okay. Well, there's some nice things to know and some really good valuable hints. First thing I suggest people to do is look at the parts list and check off each part to make sure you have everything there. That's by far the first. And it gets really frustrating when you get halfway through and suddenly find out you're missing a part. The second thing is you can look in the ARL handbook, and I can't remember the other book you published that has the resistor color code. That's something that's really a must to hang on the wall. If you have a color copier or something, copy that page, hang it on the wall, and keep it handy as a reference, because it's always easy to forget. I know there were ways we used to remember it, but I won't mention those. But look in the ARL handbook and learn the resistor color code. The other thing I suggest before you start building a kit is look through the manual and look to see what other tools, parts, or power items or requirements like a key or a headset that you might want to have handy, or a meter or what have you that you might want to have while you're building the kit. You need to see if the case that's supplied with the kit needs to be drilled, so you can make sure you have the right drill bits, drill press, or whatever you might want to use to do that. Some kits come with already pre-drilled and ready to cut out. They're already cut out boxes, like over there at Hendrix QRP kits. Their kits, a lot of them have cases that already have the holes drilled and everything. All you do is mount and go. Find out if there's technical support available for your kit. There are kits that have just like a quickie copy sheet that comes with it that has a diagram where the parts go. Sometimes it's easy enough that that's all you need. But if you're building a more complicated kit, you might want to see if the company that sells the kit will let you email them questions and get your questions answered over the web. Some of them have chat rooms, some of them have like Yahoo groups or Google groups or things like that, or email reflectors that you can get information on. Also, see if they have a phone number or fax number or email address, chat room, or a friend nearby who knows how to build kits and knows how to troubleshoot things, like a broadcast engineer or a fellow ham. Some nice items to keep on hand are pre-sorted, standardized parts. And I like to emphasize that if you ever see somebody selling an assortment of resistors or capacitors or so forth, I really, really highly recommend getting those, because a lot of times if a kit's missing a tiny little 10-cent part, you could write to the kit manufacturer and they might send it to you, but it might take them a week or two to get it to you. If you have the part in your box at home, it's worthwhile. Also, you can use them for modifications or improvements. You might say, hey, you know, I can improve the frequency response of this thing by changing this resistor or this diode or this capacitor. And that's kind of the fun of kit building, because you know how to build it, you know how to fix it, and you can modify it, improve it, do all the changes you'd like to do with it. And if you have standardized parts on hand, it makes it much, much easier. Also, if the manufacturer comes out with slight modifications, that's a good idea as well to have it available. 9-volt battery snaps are a must. A lot of kits don't come with that because you don't know what kind of power supply it might take. You don't know. So if it takes a 9-volt battery, make sure you have extra 9-volt battery snaps available. That's another flea market item I like to look for. There's also plugs, jacks, connectors. If it needs a jack to plug in a key, you got to see what kind of a plug you have at the end of your CW key or panel, and see what kind of plugs you need or jacks for it to plug into your kit. Phono plugs, all sorts of things that you want to use. Power poles in case you've got a power cable coming from it. 12-volt coaxial power jacks, those are little round things that are in most consumer electronics. Check to make sure which size the center hole is, what the polarity is, so that you don't blow up your brand new kit. Solder wick and other desoldering aids. What you have is a situation where you might put the wrong part in the wrong hole. Well, you got to be able to correct it somehow. So make sure you have some means of desoldering, namely solder wick is probably the cheapest and easiest way. There are different solder suckers out there, all the way up to vacuum desoldering tools. An emery board for enameled wire. A lot of toroids that we put in there have enameled wire, and an emery board helps clean off the insulation. I always recommend tinning it once you've cleaned off the insulation. And once again, back to power again, it's really frustrating when you get a kit put together and you don't have the right battery to power it. You might need a AA battery, a couple of AA batteries, AAA batteries, 9-volt battery to make that kit work. Nice things to have include a temperature-controlled soldering station. There's a lot of people here in the flea market and inside that sell those things. They're as cheap as about $25, $30 and as much as $200 to $300. I've seen many of them in the $50, $60 range that work wonderfully. Don't have to have a digital display, just be able to vary that temperature. A power supply that's variable is very useful. I kind of harp on power supplies because quite often the death of many kits is the wrong power being applied to it, so make sure the polarity is right and make sure that power supply is variable in case you need to produce different voltages for your different kits. A frequency counter is good, especially if you're working on a transmitter, because as you know, we hams are responsible to know which frequency we're on. So if you're building something from scratch or from a kit, you want to make sure you know which frequency it's putting out. Oscilloscopes have become a lot cheaper in flea markets nowadays. A couple years ago, I seen Tektronix 465s for $400, $500, $600. I have one on my bench that I kind of got lucky through work that they were getting rid of. I've seen them for around $100, $125 now, and they're excellent dual tray scopes. A dummy load is another thing. Dummy load's basically a big resistor, and it produces a 50 ohm load for what you're working on. Make sure it is rated at the power level that you are transmitting at, or at least you hope you're transmitting at. So the dummy load is a must because a lot of low power kits don't have any SWR protection on the output. So once again, a dummy load is a must. Great way to test so you don't put a dirty signal out on the air until you're sure everything works. Vacuum desolder station and tool, we talked about that a little bit earlier. The Heiko 808 is kind of the gold standard of handheld ones. Those are kind of a gun-like thing. It has a hollow tip, and you pull the trigger as you're holding it over the connection, and it sucks up the solder. It works real well. But those are around $200 or so. There are some that are a lot less expensive. A general coverage receiver. A general coverage receiver is very, very useful on the bench for many purposes. Number one, you can hear the signal that you're transmitting. If you're building a transmitter, you're building a receiver, you can compare it to what a regular radio is hearing. So you know if you're not getting anything, is it because you messed something up, or is the band dead? So I remember building a 20-meter CW transceiver, hooked it to my antenna, nothing, just static and noise. Turns out we had a solar flare. So make sure you use another receiver. It's also good for entertainment. I have one of these Sangean general coverage receivers that's on my bench, and I tune it to a local FM broadcast station. I listen to it so I know what's going on, especially when we have severe weather season. So once again, an AM FM clock radio can be also useful. So you can keep track of time. There's a lot of times when I lose track of time when I'm building a kit, so when I hear that legal station ID, I kind of look up. It tells me what time of day it is because it's right on the hour. And then I'll put in a couple more parts, and I hear another legal station ID. I thought, oh, that was only a few minutes. Oh, it's 4 o'clock. It's another hour later. So when you're building kits, it's easy to get kind of lost in it, and it's always good to keep track of time. Also good, it reminds you when to take a break, because fatigue is one of the ways that we mess up building kits. Random wire antenna for testing receivers. A lot of times our bench is not at our shack because we don't like hot solder near our expensive radios. So it's good to run a little random wire in there, about 20-30 feet long, so you can test a receiver. A soldering roll holder. A lot of people just put the roll of solder on the bench and unwind and stuff, and then you get kind of kinks and knots in that, or sometimes it falls off and rolls away. So I use a solder roll holder. This morning I picked up a double-decker one that holds 2 different kinds of solder on the same holder, which is kind of cool. And because I have 2 different thicknesses that I use. I have a real hair-thin one and a moderate width, so that works quite well. Those were only $9, and that was at the EAE sales booth out in the flea market, so it's really a worthwhile thing to pick up. Get a soldering roll holder. Kit storage to keep your parts secure between sessions. I have 2 cats, and they would just love to destroy my kits. So I put them away. I use a tackle box. Now let's see if it will let me... Okay, there it is. I use a Plano Box. I've found that at several different stores. I found it at Menards, which is a home improvement store. I've also found it at Cabela's and at Bass Pro Shop. You can find the same thing. It's the same number, but it comes in different colors, and for some reason it's like 3 or 4 different prices. So look it up online, that number, and it can come in any color from pink and purple to yellow and black and blue and all sorts of different colors. But I put each kit in a different tray. And then what I do is, when I'm going to work on a particular kit, I pull that tray out, and then I take the circuit board that I've stored away in that little container in the top. So now I can move that thing around with me, I can take it with me, and I have 4 different kits in there that I can work on. It's kind of a cool item, and really, really, really worthwhile. I'm going to give you a few hints. You guys like to solder, don't you? Yeah. Well, a lot of people end up, the couple connections look good, and then you end up with a blob like that. A lot of people think, well, it looks like it's soldered, the part's not going anywhere, but actually it's not making good contact. So what we do is we recommend that you use as small a tip as possible on your iron. The reason is that if you use a tip that's too wide, it's going to touch too many other parts. Don't want to do that. We don't want solder going where we don't want it to go. The other thing is, a lot of people buy their solder at Radio Shack, and most of their widths of solder are really too wide for most of the things that we make. You can get a thinner solder there, but I recommend an 031 or smaller, kind of a good number to remember, an 031 or smaller solder. And when I'm doing some more tight work, I use as little as 015 solder. It's kind of hair thin, but it works real well. What I do when I have a blob like that is I take the tip and I bring it back to that blob and I hold it right up next to the board. And what it does is it reflows the solder and it goes right on through the hole, and sometimes it comes out the other end, which is okay when you have a board that's plated through. A board that's not double-sided will never go through. It just sticks to one side. So what I do is I hold that tip there and I see it drink up the solder a bit and goes down, and then I take the tip and I pull it up. And the surface tension of the solder helps attract it to the tip as you pull it up, and it spreads it out over that wire. Well, what's left is what I call the Hershey's Kiss. And that Hershey's Kiss is the shape you really want that connection to look like. So now you're ready to trim the excess leads from the circuit board. And what I do is I use a flush cutters. And like I said, you can find those for about $6, $7. I found a set of X-Lights this morning for $7.50, which is quite a bargain for a name brand tool that will last a long time. I carefully trim the leads as close to the solder as possible, but I don't dig in too close because you don't want to cut in right next to the board. But I never leave the wire sticking out at all. I usually, the top of what I leave, it does have solder on it. Sometimes with real small parts, like the little tips from ICs or IC sockets, you have a little tiny piece that comes off and ends up in there. What you want to do is you want to inspect your board and look really, really carefully to see if any of those pieces are there, because the flux that comes off your solder is going to end up on the board, and it gets kind of sticky after a while when it's you touch it with your fingers, and those little pieces will stick to that, and you can end up with a short. So you got to be really careful. And finally, double check and make sure every time you've soldered a group of parts on the board to look again to see if there's any blobs. If it's not flowed right, you can heat it up again real quick. Makes it look a lot better and makes it work a lot better. And check once again for little tiny pieces of wire that can cause shorts. So my main kit building tips I like to tell people is remove the distractions, because phone calls and text messages and email can really get in the way of your kit building experience and kind of break your concentration. So make sure you let the voicemail answer the call and leave the speaker on so you can hear who it is and see if it's really urgent. It's always good to let that voicemail pick up. RTFM is a computer technology term. It means read the fine manual. You thought I was going to mess up on that, huh? Read the fine manual. They write it for a reason. Use a cookie sheet to keep things from getting away from you. Resistors like to roll off the table and so forth, and capacitors slide off. Surface mount parts are a real issue. A cookie sheet with a lip that goes up about an inch or so is really, really worthwhile. You don't need a Teflon one or anything. Just go buy the cheap ones at Walmart. I was over at Walmart to get some for our group kit build at the 4 Days in May last night, and it was like $4 to get a set of 3 different sizes of cookie sheets. I just passed them out. It also protects your surface, your table, so you don't want to get in trouble with the War Department at home. Be sure to have your batteries and power supply ready, as well as the plugs, jacks, and accessories needed to build your kit. Once again, keep those standard spare parts ready. You don't want to have to write the manufacturer just because there's a 10K resistor missing if you've got one. Keep your soldering iron tip clean. That's the key to making good connections. Use adequate lighting and magnification so you can see what you're doing. I'm getting old, like the rest of us, and so I need lots of light and lots of magnification. Take your time and enjoy the fun, because this is the fun of ham radio, and that is making things yourself. We're going to talk a bit about assembling coax connectors. I was going to solder right up here, and then I decided, well, I have to put down everything and go back and forth. So, and since they didn't have the table, I thought, I got an excuse, so I don't have to do that. But thankfully, I took lots of really good pictures, lots of high-res pictures like you usually see in my articles, and so we're going to talk about putting on coax connectors. Now, we're not going to talk about RG8 today because we don't have a whole lot of time, and although a lot of guys use RG8, the vast majority of antennas out there are done with RG58 and RG8X. Those have become more popular because they are less expensive, and at HF frequencies, if you're not going over 75 to 100 feet, the loss is not a real factor unless you're running high power. There's 3 parts to a PL259. You have the sleeve, the outer sleeve, you have the main body of the connector, and you have a reducer. Now there's 2 different sizes of reducers, but there's only one size of PL259. because there's two different sizes of thinner cable that go in there. RG58 uses a UG175 reducer. RG59 uses UG176, so the hole's just a little bigger to accommodate the RG8X. RG59 fits the same way as RG8X if you happen to be using 75 ohm cable, which some people do for certain types of antennas. The tools you need are a soldering iron, some good solder, wire cutters and strippers, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the cutters in just a second. Some pliers to tighten the reducer in there, and you can get some special tools to help. There are a lot of tools out there that are designed for cutting coax and stripping coax, and you can do it all in one shot, but I prefer kind of to do it the old-fashioned way. Now, on wire cutters, there are different kinds of wire cutters out there. There are real heavy dikes, and then there's little tiny flush cutters like we use on our kits. When I'm doing coax, I don't always use the little flush cutters except for maybe some trim work. I use a heavier cutter, and the reason I do that is the wire in coax is a lot thicker than the wire that you have on the board. So what's going to happen is it makes dents and stuff and ruins your little fine flush cutters, but it doesn't damage a larger wire cutter. So if I'm going to snip a piece of coax, I have a big cutter. If I'm going to trim around the outside, I might use my little flush cutters to nibble at it. And I have a special stripper that I use on the center conductor. So what we do, first off, is we slide the outer sleeve down the cable. And then we slide the reducer down, just like that, and we keep the main plug ready. So the first thing we're going to do is the way I do it is I strip the outer jacket about 1.5 inches. Okay, so it's about 1.5 inches open. And the way I do that, there's more than one way to do it. You can use a little pocket knife or something like that. Sometimes I use my little flush cutters, and I nibble a little bit at the outside insulation. You don't have to get all the way through it to the copper. All you got to do is nick it enough, because once you go all the way around, you can just flex it a little and it comes right off. So be careful not to nick the braid. If you do nick it a little bit, it's okay. It's not a major crisis. Just don't get rid of most of it. So I use a knife, or I nibble a little bit with cutters. There we go. Then I fan out the inner braid. We kind of roll the inner braid out, and some coaxes come with foil on the outside jacket, and that's to make it a lot less expensive to make coax nowadays, because copper is quite expensive. So sometimes what they do is they put a thinner braid in it, but then they use a foil jacket on the outside of that, so that you have 100% coverage on the coax. So the coax is the right impedance and everything, but it doesn't use quite as much copper. So some coax has foil on the outside. The cable I use in this example does not. So what I do is I spread it out until it's almost like individual strands. And when you're doing that, the ones that may have gotten nicked, they'll fall off. You can throw that away. Then what I do is I twist it just a couple of turns to make 2 pigtails. And so I twist them a little bit to hold the strands in place, and that also helps me get rid of any more pieces that might have been nicked. Finally, I take a wire strippers and I strip the insulation from the center core, and I leave about 1/4 inch of insulation sticking up on there. Then I cut the pigtails so they're right at about 3/8 inch, and that's kind of a magic number, because if you do it at 3/8 inch, you're going to get it just above the threads in the reducer. If it's too long and it gets into the threads, it's not going to make it very easy to tighten that reducer in the connector. So then we partially untwist, and almost all the way untwist, those little pigtails, and we push them down over the reducer sleeve, and we trim them if they're overlapping the threads. Sometimes I put just a itty-bitty tiny dab of paste flux. There's a lot of people selling these little jars of paste flux, and it really helps. So I put a tiny little dab of paste flux on that braid before I put the reducer into the main connector. Now finally, what I do is I twist the strands together in the center conductor so that one of those strands doesn't come loose and cause a short in there or keep the cable from going together. And I shove those leads all the way through the middle so it pokes through the hole. And then I screw the reducer in, and I bring it in, and I can tighten it by hand at first, and then sometimes you have to use pliers. And so what I do is I use two tiny little 4 or 5 inch vice grips, and I have one that holds the main body of the connector, and I hold it where the serrated edge is, and then I clamp one little one or a small regular pliers over the reducer, and then I just pull them opposite directions and tighten it up. Then what I do is I think I left a step off of there. I trim the extra center conductor that's sticking out beyond the end of the main body of the connector. So what you have is it looks like it's ready to go, but then we solder it. So what I do is I first solder that center conductor. And what I do is I put that soldering iron tip right in there so it's touching those wires that are right in the middle. And I bring the solder up and I just feed the solder slowly to it so it drinks it up, and so pretty soon it fills up. You don't want to go any more than that because then you'll end up with a drip coming out the other end. Then what we do is we look at the holes, and you're going to see at least 2 of the holes have braid in them. So what we're going to do is we'll put the solder there, and once again we use the iron, but you got to turn the heat up because now you're heating a heck of a lot of metal. So you turn the heat up all the way if you have a variable soldering iron. And then I fill the holes with solder, and then I even it out, and that seals it also so it keeps moisture from getting into the connector. Finally, you bring up the outer sleeve and you thread it over the main plug. And then I check it with a meter. Now what you want to do is use a continuity checker or an ohm meter. And the first check I do is between the center conductor and the outer jacket. If it shows infinite, it's good. If it shows a short, you're in trouble. Then I take the coax, and if I have both ends of the cable, like if I'm making a 3-foot jumper, I'll measure from center conductor to center conductor, if it has continuity or not, and then I measure from the jacket to the jacket. Once you're all done, you hook it up and get on the air. Anybody have any questions?